Every Friday at this elementary school, they have an assembly for all of the 4th to 6th graders to go over some historical event. Well, this time the principal introduced Mr. Hans, and she told the students that Mr. Hans flew for the Dutch Air Force during the First World War fighting against the Germans, and he's here to tell them about his experience. Mr. Hans got up and he says, "Well, children, there I was, flying in mine airplane, and I look to my left and I see a Fokker coming from my left. I look to the right and another Fokker is coming from the right." And all the children start giggling and laughing, and the principal got up and said, "Just a minute, children. You should understand that Fokker, F-O-K-K-E-R, is the name of an airplane manufacturer who made airplanes during the war for the Germans." And then Mr. Hans stood up and says, "And that's right, children, but these Fokkers was Messerschmitts." A young blonde woman gets on a plane for a flight to New York, and instead of walking to the coach seats, she walks to the first class section, sits down in the first class seat, and makes herself comfortable. A flight attendant walked over and checked her ticket and said she can't sit there. She has to sit in the back of the plane. And she said, "I'm not leaving. I'm very comfortable. These seats are comfortable." And she wouldn't budge. So the flight attendant got another crew member to come along and talk to her, and the woman still will not leave. So they finally talked to the captain to do something. The captain walked over to the woman, leaned over, whispered something in her ear, and she got up and immediately said, "Well, why didn't you say so?" And she got up and walked into the back of the plane. Well, the crew was so interested as to what happened, they asked the captain, "We couldn't do anything to get her to move. What did you say to her that got her to leave?" He said, "I just leaned over and whispered in her ear that this section of the plane does not go to New York." A well-dressed woman walks into a bank in Manhattan, goes to the loan officer and says she would like to take out a loan for $5,000 for 1 week. And the loan officer says, "Madam, we don't give loans without collateral." She says, "No problem." She takes out the keys and the registration to her Rolls Royce, and she says, "This is parked out in front of the building. Is this good enough collateral?" And he says, "Oh, no problem, madam." And he gives her the $5,000, and she leaves. A week later, she comes back and gives him the $5,000 and says, "And how much do I owe you for the interest or service charge for the use of that money?" He says, "Well, for the 1 week, it's $20. So she gives him the $20, and she gets her keys and registration and goes to leave the bank. The manager says to her, "We're very interested with all of your seemingly wealth. Why would you want to borrow $5,000? And she says, "Well, could you tell me where in New York City I could park my car for a week for $20? This fellow goes into a bar, walks up to the counter, and he tells the bartender, "Drinks for everybody, a drink for me, and a drink for you." And everybody cheers and applauds and is happy that this fellow's buying a round of drinks. About a little while later, the same fellow says to the bartender, "Bartender, drinks for everybody, a drink for me, and a drink for you." And everybody again cheers and is happy that this fellow is being so generous. This goes on about 4 or 5 times, and the bartender is getting a little concerned, and he says to the man, "I think you ought to settle up your tab. It's getting pretty big at this point." And the man reaches into his pockets and he says to the bartender, "Oh, I have no money." And the bartender gets really angry, jumps over the bar, grabs the fellow, pulls him into the back of the building, and beats him up to a pulp. He tears his clothing. The poor man's a wreck. Bartender gets up, goes back into the bar. The man gets up, brushes himself off, wipes off his bloodied face, walks back in the bar, and he says to the bartender, "Drinks for everybody, a drink for me, and none for you because you get nasty when you drink too much." The zoo is going out of business. They're closing down, and they don't know what to do with all of their animals. So they decide to call the local farmers to see if they could use any of their animals or the animals on the zoo for their farm. Well, the farmers come and they look, and they see lions and tigers and animals like that are not suited. But all of a sudden, this farmer sees a zebra. He says, "A zebra looks like a horse. Maybe we can use him on the farm like a horse." So he goes and takes a zebra and brings him to his farm. Since the zebra is not familiar with domesticated animals, he figured he'd let the zebra go around on the farm and become familiar with the other animals. And the zebra's walking along, and he sees a hen. And he looks at the hen, he says, "Ooh, what are you?" And the hen says, "I'm a hen." And he says, "What do you do around here?" And the hen says, "Oh, I lay eggs for the farmer." And the zebra walks a little further and he sees a cow. And he says to the cow, "Ooh, what are you?" And the cow says, "Oh, I'm a cow." And the zebra says, "And what do you do around here?" And the cow says, "Oh, I give milk to the farmer." And as the zebra walks a little further, sees a big bull. And he says to the bull, "Wow, what are you?" And he says, "I'm a bull." "And what do you do around here?" And the bull looks at him and says, "If you take off those silly pajamas, I'll show you what I do around here." These tourists are walking along the street in Honolulu when they see a street vendor wearing a muumuu, and they walk over to the street vendor and they say, "Excuse me, ma'am, but we have a problem with pronunciation. What is the correct pronunciation, Hawaii or Hawaii?" And the street vendor says, "Hawaii." And they say, "Well, thank you very much." And the street vendor says, "You're welcome." As people get older, their memories seem to fade a bit. And these two couples, old friends, old people, decide to go out for the evening. And they get in the car, and as old friends, the women have a tendency to sit together in the back seat, and the two men sit in the front. Well, the driver is driving along, and the passenger, his friend, says, "My wife and I went to a very nice restaurant last week, and we really enjoyed it." And his friend, the driver, said, "Oh, well, what's the name of the restaurant?" And the passenger, thinks for a moment, turns around, looks back at the women in the back seat and says, what's the name of that flower that has thorns on it? And one of the women says, Rose. And he says, right, Rose, what's the name of that restaurant? This very heavy, obese woman walks into a local drugstore. She walks over to the counter and she says to the clerk, I need some talcum powder. The clerk says to her, you could find it on aisle number 7. She says, I don't know from aisles, I don't know anything. Please show me where it is. So the clerk walks out from behind the counter and he says to the woman, walk this way. She says, if I could walk that way, I wouldn't need the talcum powder. This man who is afraid of flying and doesn't own a car has to go to Fresno, California from Los Angeles, and he has to be there in the morning for an important meeting. Well, the only way to get there is with a train, and the train leaves at 11 p.m., which arrives at 2 a.m. in Fresno and then continues up to San Francisco. Well, the fellow buys a ticket, gets on the train, and goes to the conductor and says, look, I'm a very heavy sleeper. I must get off the train at 2 a.m. when it arrives at Fresno. Here's $100. Please get me off the train. I'm a heavy sleeper. I may resist, but do whatever you have to do to get me off the train. And he says, no problem, sir. The guy goes into his cabin and goes to sleep. The next thing you know, the guy wakes up and he sees sunlight coming through the window, and he sees the train has stopped, and he looks out at 7 a.m. The train has already arrived in San Francisco. Well, he just goes out of his cabin, goes down the corridor, and gets a hold of the conductor and starts pounding on him, beating on him, screaming at him, why didn't you get me off the train at 2 o'clock in the morning when it arrived in Fresno? Now you ruined my day, you ruined my appointment. And he was very upset and he walked away. The engineer, hearing all of this, walked over to the conductor and said, wow, that fellow was pretty upset. And the conductor says, well, if you think that guy is upset, you should have seen the guy we put off the train at 2 in the morning. This woman goes into the toilet of her home, and she's sitting on the toilet, and after a while, she realizes she can't get up. She's stuck in the seat. So she calls her husband. She says, Jaime, come in here. I'm stuck in the seat. I can't get up. He says, okay, hold on. He goes in and he pulls on her. He tugs. He does everything he can to get her off, but she can't move. She's stuck in that seat. So he says, I guess we'll have to call the plumber. She says, how can you call the plumber? I'm sitting here with them exposed. And he says, don't worry about that. He goes and gets one of his hats, and he puts it on her lap to cover her up. And then he calls the plumber. The plumber comes. He looks around. He examines the toilet, looks at the lady, looks around the back of the toilet, everywhere. And the husband finally said, plumber, what can you do? And the plumber looks at him and says, you know, the woman I could save, but the guy, he's gone. The government is looking to build a tunnel through a small mountain, and they estimate it would be about a $700,000 job. And they put out bids to the request for bids to local contractors to see what the best price would be. And the bids start coming in. 700,000, 720,000, 680,000, 800,000. But one bid comes in at $70,000. Well, very curious, they thought the contractor made a mistake, and they sent him a note to please confirm his bid. And sure enough, it comes back at $70,000. Well, now they don't know what to do. They call this particular contractor in so he could explain how he intends to build a tunnel through that mountain for $70,000. He comes in, he sits down with them, with the estimators from the government, and they say, how do you intend to build this tunnel? He says, well, you see, we have a small company. It's just me and my brother. I have a truck. He has a truck. I have a shovel. He has a shovel. He goes on one side of the mountain. I go on the other side of the mountain. And we dig to the center when we meet, and you got yourself a tunnel. Well, the government estimators say that's ridiculous. What happens if you don't meet in the middle? He says, well, what do you care? You're going to wind up with two tunnels for the price of one. A priest, a minister, and a rabbi are talking about how they raise money for their institutions. The priest says after their services are over, they take the money they collect and they bring it into the back office. They draw a chalk line, a square, on the floor in the office, and they throw the money up in the air. Whatever falls within the square belongs to God, and whatever falls outside the square belongs to them. Well, the minister says that we do something similar, but instead of drawing a square, we draw a circle. Whatever falls into the circle belongs to God. Whatever falls outside of the circle belongs to us. And the rabbi says, we do something different. We don't draw lines, we don't draw squares or circles. We just throw the money up in the air. Whatever stays up belongs to God. Whatever comes down belongs to us. A woman walks into her neighborhood butcher shop and sees pork chops in the refrigerated counter space and asks the butcher, how much are the pork chops? He says, they're $5 a pound. And she says, wow. She said, that's expensive. Schultz across the street, Schultz's butcher shop, he charges $2 a pound. So the butcher says to her, well, go over to Schultz and get him over there. She says, well, Schultz is out of them right now. He says, oh, well, when I'm out of them, they're only $1 a pound. A woman walks into a men's shop, and one of the clerks walks over to her and says, may I help you? She says, yes, I want to return some underwear I bought for my husband. And the clerk says to her, well, no problem, madam, we'll be happy to refund your money. And he goes to fill out the papers. He says, what's wrong with the underwear? And she thinks a minute, and she looks embarrassed, and she doesn't want to say anything to the guy. So she says, you know the ballroom down on Main Street? He says, there's no ballroom there. She says, yeah, that's what's wrong with the underwear.